Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Gayo Muggle land by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. Love, Rinse, Repeat is supported by Uniting Mission and Education, part of the Synod of New South Wales ACT, and I thank them for their support. My guest today is Leah DeVun. Leah, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So for those who don't know, Leah is the Associate Professor of History and Vice Chair for Undergraduate Education at Rutgers University. Her research focuses on the history of gender, sexuality, science in medicine, pre-modern Europe, as well as on contemporary queer and transgender studies. We're going to talk about this new book, which I don't usually have them on the e-version, but I'm going to hold it up anyway. The Shape of Sex, Non-Binary Gender from Genesis to the Renaissance, which is out with Columbia University Press, New York, which is a really exciting and fascinating book. And I mentioned this to you before, Leah, that I tweeted out that I'm just realizing now I wasn't looking at the screen. You cannot see that at all, can you? When I held that up. That I tweeted out that I was going to be talking to you about this book, and a friend just was like, oh wow, like that just sounds so fascinating. And so let's just go with a broad picture here. What got you interested in this idea of a book to research, and what are your kind of hopes as you kind of dove into it?
Sure. Well, why don't I just give a few seconds about what the book is about, just for people who are not familiar with it at all, and then I'll back up and talk a little bit how I got into it in the first place. Right. So The Shape of Sex is a book that is about ideas and individuals who were thought to cross the boundary between male and female sex and gender in Europe between the years of about 200 and 1400. So I look at a lot of different kinds of texts in the book, texts that are by theologians, by natural philosophers, cartographers, physicians, lawyers. So I'm casting my net pretty widely in terms of both the kind of text that I'm looking at and in terms of the time frame, which is also pretty big. So the kind of big picture argument of the book is I look at the ways in which thinkers during that time period developed and upheld a binary system of sexual difference. That is the idea that male and female are the only legitimate natural sexes that humans can belong to. And so what I argue is that this is something that happened in a particular place, in a particular time, that was in response to, the particular historical circumstances. So that shows us that that binary sex is a historical phenomenon. That is, it depends on time and place, and it's not just a timeless or unchanging or natural division of humankind. I also show how during this period, people used ideas about non-binary sex to not just create a division between male and female, but also to organize their political worlds, their religious worlds, their natural worlds, coming up with a big structure of putting in order their societies and deciding who was able to be considered human and accepted as like a protected member of the human community. So that's kind of the overview of what the book is about and how I got into it. I mean, I have a long history of being interested in medicine and the way that medicine and science reflect ideas about gender and sexuality and religion, going back to when I was a pre-med student back, as an undergraduate. And I'm happy to come back to that. But in terms of the specific book, my first book looked at ideas about alchemy. So I had spent a lot of time looking at manuscripts of alchemy. And alchemy in this case was something that was trying to not just create gold, but create medicines for humans. So I was looking at alchemy as really kind of like a forerunner of pharmacology. And in a lot of the alchemical manuscripts that I was looking at for my first book, I kept encountering ideas about an alchemical hermaphrodite. That is an idea that there was some kind of special substance that transformed people that was imagined to be non-binary sexed.
Hmm.
And so it kept striking me, why did these alchemists who are so interested in human health, who are so interested in societal transformation, imagine the transformative substance that they were talking about as a non-binary sexed figure. And at this very same time period that I was seeing these images, my partner, who is transgender, had top surgery, which is a kind of a gender affirming surgery. So kind of all of these links in my professional world and my personal world were kind of all coming together to focus me very closely on ideas about bodies, on categories, on identities. And that's when I turned to thinking about, how do we get a binary system of sexual division, and how does it reflect all the different kind of cultural concerns that are in place over a long period of time, and kind of what are the consequences of that kind of idea of division. So that's how we got here.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's really cool. Thank you for that. I think one of the things that is interesting, as you say, is that just how widespread this consideration was, because we're so often like bombarded with this idea that, consideration of gender outside of the binary, or even this idea that there could be an outside of binary, is like, a novel later 20th, early 21st century kind of idea. But what you're showing is, like, even though a lot of the times the considerations maybe weren't very much focused on actual individuals, that this idea of non-binary sex, this idea of those outside of this binary was prolific, right, and across a lot of different fields. And as you say, it was not just like sometimes this kind of periphery thought, but was like actually like a kind of key organizing category for yes, much bigger discussions, and we're going to get into quite a lot of that. But I guess, I mean, were you surprised about maybe almost that you kept finding things? And I guess, was there anything in particular that during the research you were like, oh, I just would have that's the true, like, surprising find of the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those things. The first thing that I often note is, we tend to think of non-binary sex as sort of a marginal or a rare concern. And sort of my first surprise was how many places I found discussions of non-binary sex across so many different kinds of texts and across so many different centuries. So I think that really, challenges our idea that these figures are rare, that they're not really talked about, and that they just kind of are at the periphery of society. When really, I found so many of these figures, I wasn't even able to include them all in my, my hundreds of pages of text. I could come up with a, volume 2. There are so many of these kinds of figures. And beyond that, the fact that even in the ways that they they do appear in short snippets of text, in some cases they intervene in histories that we consider really central to how we understand this long and critical time period in Europe, and in fact encompass some of the major historical developments and historical actors or figures in some cases that we associate with the period. I mean, for instance, I would say one of the most surprising figures that I found associated with non-binary sex was the Jesus, so-called Jesus hermaphrodite, the non-binary sexed Jesus. So incredibly surprising, in as much as, the idea that, this, I mean, undeniably central figure in the history of Christianity and the history of Europe, and beyond, was ever imagined as something beyond just simply male, comes as a big surprise to a lot of people. And I think it also shows us that these sorts of ideas are ones that, that can't really be ignored as we look at a broader history of Europe, because ideas about non-binary sex are implicated in how people configured not just maleness and femaleness, but how they came up with an identity of Europe, how they figured who was a Christian, who was allowed to be within the community, how it affected relationships between Christians and Jews during critical moments in interreligious relations, during critical moments in the political contests that were surrounding the Near East that we often now call the Crusades. So, these are ideas that may at first seem small, but when we look at them in terms of these big narratives, they play a more pivotal role than we might expect. So, I think that those are all important reasons to look at this history. And beyond that, I think another really important thing for everyone to take away is that in the modern world, we, and I mean by that, not just the general public, but also those of us who are members of, queer and trans and non-binary communities, tend to think of gender nonconformity, non-binary gender, trans, as all new, right? And this is the argument that's often made, by those who are anti-trans, by those who are trans exclusionary, that gender nonconformity is a threat to traditional gender. And part of what I try to do in my book is show that gender nonconformity, that non-binary categories of gender have been with us for a very long time. They're not new. And we can't go back to a period of time before non-binary gender when people were just simply male or simply female. These kinds of ideas, individuals, and debates about what these categories of sex mean for society, they've been with us for as far back as I go, and probably farther.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that we'll come back to a bit about that, and particularly how that impacts today toward the end. I think that's a really important discovery as you push this argument through. I want to pick up maybe on where you were talking about a bit there around the change in the 12th and the 13th century, and particularly about that those the way non-binary sex played a part in the kind of in those kind of relationships between Christians and Jews and Christians and Muslims, that there was how it was utilized in this project of kind of establishing almost a non-human other. You were talking before about how this isn't just about categories of male and female. It becomes engaged in a lot of other bigger categories. So yeah, and then how that obviously whenever you want to create a non-human other, it's usually because you're trying to get to violence, and I guess, as you say, kind of get to establishing who can live in a Christian territory. So you could talk to us a bit. Let's kind of dive in a bit more into that kind of part of the book, and how this kind of gets employed and weaponized in these kind of in these interfaith geographic conflicts.
Sure. I mean, I think that the key shift we start to see for this kind of these kinds of polemics and this language that's anti-Muslim or anti-Jewish, and using binary sex figures as part of the derogatory picture of those groups by Christians, is during the period of wars over the Holy Land, the Crusades, so to say, and also in the events that came before the expulsion of Jews from Christian communities in Europe around the turn of the around 1300. So what we see during these time periods is we begin to see images of Jews and Muslims as so-called hermaphrodites, or as figures that were imagined to shift back and forth between male and female sex, and that these were part of polemics that were intended to dehumanize and insult Muslim and Jewish communities. So just to take one example, there's an English map called the Hereford Map that was created in about 1300. And it's an interesting document for a lot of reasons. And it has a lot of crusading propaganda, we might say, that's a part of it. And one of the images that it has on it is an image of a Muslim as half male and half female in Africa, along with a little caption that tells us that this individual is part of a race of both sexes who are unnatural. And it's tapping into this long myth about the so-called monstrous races. And this was a myth that was present in Europe, since antiquity. that imagined that outside of Europe, especially in Africa and Asia, there were people who were, whole communities of people who were monsters. That is, they were, their bodies were extraordinarily different from, so-called ordinary Europeans, and their cultural practices, especially their sexual practices, were also kind of outside the bounds of human behavior. So anyone who's going to be looking at that image of a Muslim in Africa being depicted as this traditional image of a non-human sort of monster, and one who, they're going to be aware is attached to this kind of idea of sex changing, that's going to be a very derogatory, very very dehumanizing kind of image of Muslims at a time when, Christian military incursions into Muslim areas are ongoing, so this is, scholars have seen this as rationalization for violence against communities that are depicted as non-human, as well as ways of showing that they belong outside of the geographical bounds of Christian society. So in that way, rationalizing Christians taking over these territories and expunging them of non-Christians. So we just have to look at this as part of a rhetoric that is about religion, but I think it's also about bodies and bodily difference too. So I think that one of the things that has been useful for me has been thinking about how we fit the history of gender and sex into a extended history of race, how we make hierarchies between people based on sort of a nexus of cultural and physical differences that that also allow people to to place societies in hierarchical orders and to justify these kinds of violent and exclusionary sorts of actions against others.
Thank you for that. So then, moving out of that time period, kind of in both directions, because there's that, as you say, that dehumanizing use there, but there are other uses through this time period, and so you kind of have on both sides. I'm thinking of you kind of talk about the early Christian ideas of this kind of Adam androgyny, that the idea that the Adam figure was before male was a kind of was either genderless or both gender, and that's kind of this, in a lot of these texts, this kind of idealized human form, and then on the other side you have of this period, you have what you were talking about earlier, the Jesus hermaphrodite, and you kind of talk about them as these like anchors of the eschatological age, the Adam and the Christ figure, both being envisioned in a not a negative way as non-binary sex bodies. So to kind of tackle them both, but at the same time. But I'm interested in those are quite, as you said, surprising things to be exploring. So talk about that, and I guess how that maybe then shaped, or did that then permeate out into broader attitudes to people with differently sexed bodies, or did it kind of just stay in this kind of level of the an idealized religious kind of figure?
Right. Okay. Well, I have a lot of things to say about
sorry,
this.
that was too many questions.
So, the first point that I want to make is that, one of the things that this shows is that there isn't one unchanging idea about sex and gender categories, right? We can just see in the time period that I'm looking at that ideas about non-binary sex change enormously over the time period that I cover, right? I mean, you can see how, I hate to boil things down to positive and negative, but, we can see that, there's a kind of waxing and waning set of ideas about binary sex. So, I mean, that again speaks to the idea that different cultures over different time periods have vastly different approaches to how they categorize and make meaning of sex and gender, right? So again, going to the point that this isn't sort of a natural, changeless way of thinking about humankind, and so hence that might give us some humility of thinking about how the way we categorize and think about sex and gender might be similarly just a part of a waxing and waning that's going to continue to change in the future. So another thing I think is that when we then tend to think of the distant past, if I can kind of generalize a bit, we tend to think of it as more brutal, more restrictive, more marginalizing of difference, right? That's often assumed to be the case. So I think one of the surprises is that during this period that I look at, non-binary sex was not always something to be corrected, to be erased, to be denigrated. Sometimes it was imagined to be something that was not just neutral, but ideal, something that could be associated with angels, with Adam, with Jesus, with some of the most celebrated, rarefied kind of characters of excellence during the time period. So, we can't make any assumptions about, about the way that non-binary sex is received, because, we can see that there's a huge amount of variation, and that includes some perhaps surprises for us about, how we might compare to earlier societies in terms of our own imagination of the meanings of non-binary sex. So as you say, the book begins and ends with an idealized sort of non-binary character. The first one is the so-called primal androgen. And this is the idea that some Jewish and Christian interpreters of the Bible had in reading the creation stories in Genesis, that made them imagine that God created the first human as an androgen, or a man-woman, right? A combination of male and female characteristics that was something beyond binary divisions. So the theologians and biblical commentators who seized upon that idea imagined that the original, most perfected characteristic of humans when they were closest to the image of God was one that hadn't yet been split into male and female separate sexes, right? And that the division of humans into those sexes was kind of like a devolution from biblical perfection. And for some of them, they argued that that came after the fall into sin. So for them, the idea of binary male and female sex was the fallen, sort of broken type of, of human nature, whereas the more perfected human nature, as it was intended by God, was undifferentiated, non-binary, not given to sexual intercourse and difference. Okay, so and we can talk more about what the kind of fates of that idea were, but it's one that continued to have people who argued for it for over 1,000 years. So this continued to be an attractive way of thinking about creation. So when people start thinking about what's the perfect form of the human, what is the form that we started with? What is the form that we return to, right, at the eschaton, at the end of time? Again, they start to imagine that perfection in terms of non-binary sex, non-binary bodies. And we can see that both in the terms of what you just mentioned, the Jesus hermaphrodite, and that is towards the end of the period, we start to see not just in alchemy, as I mentioned at the beginning, but also in devotional texts and other kinds of literature, a sort of picture of Jesus as both masculine and feminine, and as well as both human and divine. And thinking about that in terms of a non-binary sex or a non-binary figure was a way for them to imagine this sort of sloughing off of these divisions, this returning to a sort of like divine simplicity. And they imagined that in terms of this figure. These ideas about what we return to, what's the most ideal form of the human, also comes up in theologies of the resurrection. So I think what's important to say is that when certain Christians over a long period of time imagined like what the perfect form of the human was, they imagined it as without sex and gender, that was divided into maleness and femaleness. Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I had muted myself.
Okay, I
gotcha. And again, that goes fascinating to the point of what you say, when this kind of ever novelty, ever newness of when we claim what these discussions. So I'm curious that just a bit about that more. So there's this idea of is it always kind of this link of a non-binary sex body in that way, and also then a non-sexed body, as in like by getting rid of that division, you also get rid of the need for sex, or the reality of actually having sex. Are they kind of like and obviously because particular periods and places of Christianity, chastity and monasticism and things like that are so highly valued as well? Is it are those kind of always kind of coupled together? And similarly, Jesus, isn't depicted as someone who has sex. So is there similarly kind of a linking between, if you remove that kind of binary, you also then remove, a desire to be with someone sexually?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about a lot of different kinds of non-binary categories in the book. So I'm talking about individuals who we would now call intersex, right? People whose bodies aren't typically simply just male or female, right? I'm also talking about people who are imagined to transgress or change gender in terms of their practices or their identity in some way. We might put that under the transgender umbrella. I could talk more about that. I'm also talking about what we might now categorize as asexual or agender kinds of categories, as well as a number of other ones, and putting them all under the non-binary umbrella for the purposes of my book. I think you're right that when theologians were thinking about sort of divine perfection in terms of these sexualized categories, they were thinking often not of non-binary as a doubling of sexes, although some of them were. But many of them were talking about a sort of erasure of all difference, like an undifferentiation that, yes, placed people outside of the temptations of sexual desire, of the kinds of social divisions and hierarchies that accompany marriage and patriarchy, and many of kind of the sort of institutional powers that were based on those kinds of divisions. But they weren't generally imagining it in terms of equality. Like, there's a lot of variability here, but many of these people were thinking of it as sort of like an androgyny that was male inflected, where femininity is kind of subsumed into this sort of like masculinized, sexuality erased androgyny. So, these are not feminist texts for the most part. They're texts that are suspicious of sexual difference and sexuality. Not in every case, but certainly in some of these cases, they are imagining the perfect human society as being one freed from the constraints of both sexual desire, but also gender obligations, right? The gendered obligations of that imposed social commitments. Yeah. So, but I think what's really interesting is just to note that, even in the face of all this kind of variability and these different thinkers in these different time periods, when people start thinking about like, what's a perfect society, like the society of heaven, what's a perfect society, like paradise before the fall, they're imagining it as free of gender constraints, as something beyond the binary. And I just think that's very interesting.
Yeah, that really is. So obviously the book covers, this a long span of time. And as you say, there's this waxing and waning, and there's lots of difference. If you were to now, or if not you, someone were to now like really dive into one of those periods, like what do you think is the one you most want to see? Like, I want to see its own full large book tome length treatment on one of these ones. Which do you think is like, you'd really like to see, like either yourself or other historians and scholars start to dig into, that you think either has been under examined or just has the most, like, that you were like, oh, I can't believe I have to cut this?
Yeah. Well, I just want to, take this opportunity to really praise and celebrate so much work that's now being done by queer and trans and non-binary historians and others too, to look at this material. I think there's just been a huge explosion of interest and really excellent writing in transgender and non-binary history. And so, there are topics that I wish I had gotten to, but I'm so pleased to see that so many people are getting to them and doing it in wonderful ways. I think of M.W. Bachowski's new work. That's I mean, she has lots of work coming out all the time, but I believe she's working on a book on a lot of individuals who we might, put under the transgender umbrella. People like Eleanor Reichner, who I only get to briefly in my book. I think Joan of Arc as well. Figures that certainly deserve to be looked at through the lens of all of the kind of new theories and historical scholarship that's been growing over this last decade. There's new work by Robert Mills, Roland Betancourt, Alice Spencer Hall, and Blake Gutt on transgender saints that I think is really fascinating work. So I think that even with as big as my project felt to me, there was still so much that I wasn't able to cover. And that, like I said, I'm just really gratified to see so much new work coming out. And also the ways that scholars who are working on later periods are really connecting, these earlier periods to how we now think about a developing sense of gender identity, of gender practice, and really being able to place all of our kind of current debates into a much greater historical framework, which I just think is really great for the field. And I really look forward to being able to read the new work that's coming out. So if I could do more, I would have done some of those things, but I don't need to because, because we'll just be able to look forward to all these new works coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of started to answer it there, but I think almost anytime I have a historian on the podcast, I just ask them, at some point, why study the past? But as you started to kind of develop this, and we've talked a bit throughout, there's kind of almost two trajectories of why in the book. In some sense, there's what we've talked about of saying, like, look, this has been a conversation topic. This is not new. It's not, the first time that people have considered non-binary sex. It's not the first time this has happened. And as you say, and it's not only ever been in a kind of totally denigrating, dehumanizing manner either. And then I guess also there's this sense of thus that should disrupt and disturb any kind of claims of kind of naturalness or immutability that are often evoked in contemporary debates, right? That there's that the views of gender we inherited from, say, 30 years ago, 40, 50, are these natural ones that have always existed and never deigned to be questioned. And this kind of, the often leveling of the ever newness. I was trying to find it before. There was a great review I read on about Tori Peters' Transition Baby, which is talking about like so much of the rhetoric around that as always being like the first, and that there's always this claim of everything, trans is always new. And so, but like, here you're kind of undercutting that through the study of history by showing, it's not ever new. It actually exists within, there's a much more contested, broad, diverse trajectory. So yeah, I guess, thinking a bit about, why write the book and why study the past in terms of the current context. I'm curious to hear your thoughts of how much that played in your mind as you were going, and how it kind of, what you're hoping that those who are reading this book, which is going to be all my listeners, everyone, is how that might shape some of the thinking about the present and future.
Yeah, I mean, this is always the tension that historians face, right? Past as, as resonant with, as anticipating the present, and past as like radical difference, right? And the thing that is, that makes it difficult to pick between those two different ways of interpreting history is that they're both there, right?
Yeah.
I think, it's kind of the cliche of the history book, the moment that everything changed, right? I think that my work is kind of like on the opposite end. It's the way many things never change, as well as change is happening and will continue to happen. So I think that the way that we can look at the past and even in this very distant period that I focused on, we can see a lot that looks familiar. We can see in the legal handling of non-binary sex and gender. We can see in the kind of medical management of intersex patients in the pre-modern period, a lot that we can see happening in our own time. And so I think where we can see these similarities, that they do give us some insight into why we think the way we do and why we do some of the things that we do. And so, that continuity can help us to place ourselves in time. I think on the flip side, where we see things as totally unfamiliar, as done a completely different way, that can help us to understand that there isn't one way, right? There's no one correct understanding. There's no correct version of systematizing these ideas, and that's probably going to mean that things are going to be radically different, 50 or 100 years from now. I think that the other side of that, thinking about continuity and what do I want the book to do is by seeing that these ideas, that these individuals have been around for this long period of time. I think that, as historians and activists in marginalized communities have long tried to show, trans, queer, non-binary, intersex people, they have a history. And I hope that can, and for many of us, that can help us to kind of find a place for ourselves across time, can find kinship across time, and sort of a meaningfulness of a place in the present. Also, for many people in society, history is a legitimating force. So to say this has existed in the past is a way of being able to claim that these individuals have a place in the present, they have a place in the future. And while we don't need, those who oppose human rights to, we don't need them to legitimate the existence of these marginalized communities. We can't deny that is a rhetorical force that's important. So, so I hope that this work will continue to lay a foundation for making claims for the legitimacy and presence and the defense of non-binary lives in the present and the future.
Thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you so much for that. That final word was so helpful. So the book, I'm not going to try to hold it up to the screen again because clearly.
I have one.
Oh, hold it up. The book.
Let's pull it off the shelf.
Yeah, we gotta have a look at the actual cover. The book, folks, is The Shape of Sex: Nonbinary Gender from Genesis to the Renaissance, out with Columbia University Press. Please go pick it up. Call your libraries, get them to get it. Really, let's get that happening. Leah, is there anything else you want to promote or draw people's attention to at this time?
Yeah, I just want to say that in addition to being a historian who writes academic texts, I'm also an artist and a curator who works with the histories of queer, feminist, gender nonconforming communities. And I try in that capacity to also create opportunities for all of those communities to be able to represent themselves through their own artwork, through their own abilities to show and speak about themselves, and and to be able to counter discourse that's always written about them by other people. So I guess I will just promote the other kind of work that I do in the artistic world that's in collaboration with a lot of different individuals and communities, and that I hope can bring some of these ideas to a different sort of audience that maybe is not going to pick up an academic book, but maybe will go into a community space or some kind of arts venue and be able to learn about these ideas and debates in a way that will make them want to delve further into this whole set of questions.
That's awesome. That sounds so cool. That's great. Well, thank you so much for this conversation again. Everyone go and get the book, and I'll see you all next week. Bye.
Thank you so much.